Hey y'all, I'm James Roy, aka M1 Texans fan, and welcome to another 10-minute Texans talk. Today, we're going to be looking back at all of the first round picks that the organization has made, making correlations between how good GMs did, and really just looking at how good or bad the picks were. So, without further ado, let's start and throw it all the way back to 2002. I've always looked at the 2002 draft as the right pick that just didn't work out. I don't see very many organizations upstart, going into their first draft, having, set up kind of a roster and having the number one overall pick, passing on a quarterback, short of maybe like the 2014 draft class. I'm not going to put Johnny Manziel or Blake Bortles in as my franchise quarterback, and you can justify going the route of a defensive player like Jadeveon Clowney. But in the 2002 draft class, when you're choosing between Julius Peppers and David Carr, it's really hard to justify having a prospect like what David Carr was and going, I think we can just go Julius Peppers because he'll probably be great, and it's more of a sure thing. So I don't really fault the Texans for this pick. Some people look back and hindsight's 2020. Obviously, you can look at the careers that they've had and go, we should have picked Julius Peppers, but I don't think this is a bad pick to start Charlie Casserly's term as GM. It's definitely the best decision that he had given the circumstances. Now, in 2003, the Texans did what some organizations in this league have never done, and that is drafted a truly great elite future Hall of Famer, should really already be Hall of Famer in Andre Johnson. And looking back at this draft, it's interesting to see because the Lions picked right before the Texans, and believe it or not, they picked Charles Rogers. Now, I did a little digging on Charles Rogers, and Charles Rogers played 3 seasons in Detroit. That is it. And then his career was over. I didn't really look into why it was suddenly over. I can only assume it has something to do with him not being cut out for the NFL. But, my apologies if that's not the reason. So this one obviously is the biggest hit of Charlie Casserly's tenure. When we look at the rest of his tenure, we're looking at 04 with Dante Robinson, Jason Babin, who we traded back into the first round to get, and then Travis Johnson. Of those 3 players, Dante Robinson's obviously the best hit, played great cornerback for us, played out his rookie contract, obviously was frustrated to get the franchise tag, but still showed out, had a solid career, and I wouldn't say that was a bad draft pick. Jason Babin definitely had his best years in Philly. No doubt about that. The stretch in 2010, 2011, where he put up I believe it was 13 and 14 sacks, his 2 Pro Bowl seasons are great, but for the Texans, he never really was that great for us. So I would say Charlie Casserly's tenure is very much defined by the Andre Johnson pick. And I don't fault him for the David Carr pick, but 04 and 05 I think are what really did him in as a GM. And so now we enter the era of Rick Smith. The 2006 draft is a draft that sticks out to a lot of Texans fans. It's really the earliest that I remember as a Texans fan being super invested in who the Texans were going to pick. Because I was 11 and I was finally able to really, do my own thinking on that instead of just kind of knowing who we picked after the fact. And so I remember where I was in my great grandmother's house, watching the draft ticker on the bottom of the screen and watching and hearing Mario Williams' name called and being like, Mario who? That's not Vince Young. And I felt like I was in the minority because I wanted Vince Young, and there was people that thought we should take Reggie Bush before we should take Vince Young. Which shows you how valuable the running back position was back then relative to now. But all that said, hindsight's 2020. It's a common theme of drafting when we're looking back, 18 years, but around 18 years. But Mario Williams did great in his time on his rookie contract playing for the Texans, and then he went on to have a great career. He had. I feel like through '08, through his first 3 years, he did really well. He kind of fell off a little bit, and then he revitalized his career with the Bills and, found his place. Not a bad pick, and it's certainly better than the pick we could have had. The only unknowns we have are, do we think that Vince Young would have had a better go of it if he had been drafted by us rather than the Titans? But, other than that, we look at 2007, that's obviously a bust with Amobi Okoye. Jeez, I'm tongue-tied. But, I don't know. This is like the cautionary tale of why someone from Nigeria who's not maybe is pretty fresh in the game of football. Sometimes you get those cool stories where it works out, and sometimes you don't. And the Texans ended up on the wrong side of that. '08, Rick Smith hit with Dwayne Brown, his left tackle of his entire tenure. Now, him and Brian Cushing, the next pick, all played right through Rick Smith's era. Once Rick Smith left, they left. And Kareem Jackson in 2010 also played right up until about a year after Rick Smith left. But Rick Smith, I think, is easily the best GM in Texans history. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And that's because, we've already looked at pretty much there's only two other GMs to look at, and they don't really have three other GMs technically, and they don't really have a long pedigree of great picks. So having been the GM of the Texans for as long as he had, it was bound to be Rick Smith, even with any whiffs that he had, which is very few. So Kareem Jackson, 2011, J.J. Watt, I would say this is tough. It's tough for Charlie Casserly. You kind of look at Andre Johnson and you go, him. That's what defines his tenure as a GM. But when you look at Rick Smith's run, J.J. Watt, I would say there was already two picks before that that you could say in Dwayne Brown and Brian Cushing could be contending to define his tenure as a GM. J.J. Watt comes in and sweeps that out from under their feet. He is easily the best pick thus far in Rick Smith's tenure. But then we get into Whitney Merciless. Whitney Merciless was a surprise. I tell people all the time, regardless of what the Texans do, I'll find a way to justify it. And that was one where I had to go back and I had to look at the stat sheet to really make it make sense. J.J. Watt made it easy because at some point he proved that he was worth that pick. Whitney Merciless took a little more time. He was a little more of a project. But I'm going back. I'm like, hey, he led the NCAA in sacks before he got drafted. And they're like, yeah, for 1 year. It was like the only production he showed. And so watching him actually come to fruition in the Bulls on Parade defense for a short period and actually produce made me feel happy. I view Whitney Merciless fondly. I think in comparison to Rick Smith's tenure as GM in terms of like first round picks, he's not necessarily the best thing that happened to the team, but I always liked Whitney Merciless. I enjoyed how he played. And then in 2013, DeAndre Hopkins. You heard of him? DeAndre Hopkins. Now, Andre Johnson's the best receiver in Texans history. There's no doubt. DeAndre Hopkins is right there behind him. And honestly, I wish he hadn't left, but because he left, he ruined his chances of taking over that crown. There's nothing he's going to do in the rest of his career that's going to surpass Andre Johnson in any way on any team. But DeAndre Hopkins is a truly great wide receiver. And I think when we look at the tiebreaker between him and J.J. Watt for who defines Rick Smith's tenure as GM, it's got to be J.J. Watt based on all-time greatness and truly unequivocated, just outright greatness. I think DeAndre Hopkins is truly great on the roster, but he also left the roster earlier than J.J. Watt did and trailed off. I guess you could factor in J.J. Watt's injuries, but I don't know. Just the stretch where J.J. Watt was great. Now I'm talking myself out of it. I don't know. I'd say it's a tie. DeAndre Hopkins and J.J. Watt equally defined that tenure. The only other picks that Rick Smith made, Jadeveon Clowney, sure, kind of. I wouldn't say that was an amazing pick. It was obviously the right pick based off of hindsight, and he didn't have a bad tenure. And maybe if he had more time, but I've never been super high on Jadeveon Clowney because I watched him come up and be this truly dominant force from high school through college, and then just pick the absolute wrong time based on the team that I like to just drop off. And then you got, Kevin Johnson, cornerback. Anyone remember him? I do. I remember hoping and praying that he would be great, but that was not the case. Then you got Will Fuller. I remember draft night hearing this stat. Will Fuller's got the highest drop rate of any receiver entering this class, and I thought to myself, his speed might make up for that, maybe, and it did for a little bit when he was healthy. And but after so many dropped passes that could have won us games, I was over Will Fuller. And then Deshaun Watson is a good note to end on if we don't factor in his history as a person and how he left the organization. I think if none of that happened and he's still here, I think that that we could be talking differently about that pick in general. But I don't think that we can say that pick was bad based on what we got out of it, both in the trade of him leaving and in his time here. I'm quick to say I think some people overhype what Deshaun Watson was. You could make the argument, and I'm not fully sold on this, but I've overheard that that Bill O'Brien is truly the reason Deshaun Watson excelled in Houston because of the offense that Bill designed around him. I don't know if I want to give Bill O'Brien that kind of credit because I personally don't like the guy. It's like John Calipari in Memphis. You say his name, I don't want to talk about it. But that's the end of the Rick Smith era. So up next is Brian Gaine, but Brian Gaine never had a first round pick. So actually up next is Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien made one first round pick, and that first round pick was Titus Howard. I appreciate Titus Howard. He's a great right tackle. I don't think that we should by any means move on from him. I'd love to extend him. I'd love to give him a nice extension to keep him around because I think it's going to be good market value and it's going to keep this offensive line where it needs to be moving forward, regardless of who's the signal caller behind that offensive line. So I can't really, early on it was easy to kind of throw those stones, but over the course of his tenure with the team, Titus Howard has shown to be worth the first round pick. And speaking of, taking a little time, after Bill O'Brien left, because he didn't have any more first round picks in his time, we enter Nick Caserio. This will be quick because Caserio first year didn't have any first round picks, and we all know because we're only a year removed from that draft that he went Derek Stingley. Some will follow that sentence up with over Sauce Gardner, and I feel like if you're trying to make a decision on whether or not someone was a bust after 1 year, I don't know if I can. I'm not ready to have that discussion yet. I think that most people are not ready to have that discussion yet. Anyone who's using that as a point is just either pushing an agenda to say that Caserio is trash, or they're pushing an agenda to say that the Jets are better, or they just have something to sell you, and they don't want to really talk about the fact that Derek Stingley didn't play for 6 weeks, which I guess kind of fits their agenda, injury prone. But I mean, Derek Stingley hadn't played enough football. He hadn't played in a system that fits his talents. To say that he's a bust or that we should have taken Sauce Gardner at this point is kind of ignorant of the fact that time is what we need to know whether or not that's the case. We're not going to know that right now just based off of watching, this past season. Kenyon Green, likewise, obviously I was really frustrated with the way he played. It was interesting to see when he went out how the offensive line performed better in those short stretches, and Davis Mills seemed to have more time. But I am interested to see if Kenyon Green can, make the next step. I'm not as sure of it as I am with Derek Stingley. That I think Derek Stingley has what it takes to do it, and Kenyon Green, I think he can. I can't really make that guess confidently yet. Like I haven't been given the same level of confidence in Kenyon Green, but I know that it's possible. I know that he can, and this is really what it's going to be with Nick Caserio is this draft class right here. Just these two players, really. You could look at the rest of the draft class, but these two players picking it up next year and the next year's draft class coming out swinging is what's really going to remove the heat from Nick Caserio's seat, if you believe there is any. And I'd say being on your third coach, regardless of the circumstances by which you came to it as a GM, puts the heat on the seat. And so, yeah, that's really it. With the draft classes, I just kind of wanted to try and spitball my thoughts about them, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. If there's anything you guys would like me to talk about as it pertains to Houston sports, go ahead and drop it in the comments. And Yeah, till next time, this has been probably a little longer then, but a 10-minute Texans talk. Thank you.